Welcome mindsetters. Today we're doing the history matric revision and the focus is the origins of the Cold War. I'm quickly going to underline the origins because I want you to take note of that we are not looking at the actual events, but we are looking at the origins of the Cold War. And we've selected a few questions from the 2014 exemplar. Those are the questions we'll be working with to teach you the skills as to how you can go about answering questions in the exam. So before we look at the actual sources and the questions, let's look at the checklist. There are a few things that you have to make sure of before you can tackle the exam question. You need to make sure that you know the structure of the exam. That is very, very important because you don't want to study a theme that is not in that particular paper that you will be writing. You also need to know that you understand the concepts related to that theme. As I've already said to you, we are looking at the origins of the Cold War. So you should be able to define the term or the concept Cold War and communism, capitalism, and so on. So whatever theme you are dealing with, make sure that you know all the historical terms and concepts and also the historical figures related to that theme. Okay, and then the next thing you need to know is how to apply the skills. So I'm going to quickly underline that. As you know, in history, there are different skills that are part of this subject. You need to know how to analyze sources. You need to know things like usefulness of the source, reliability, and so on. So you need to be able to apply those skills when you're analyzing the different types. I'm also going to underline different types of sources because what will happen is you will get a written source, a visual source in the form of a photograph or in the form of a cartoon. So you should be able to analyze those different types of sources. And then the next thing you need to be able to do is to be able to construct a coherent argument using evidence. That is very, very important in an extended writing question. So what you will find in the exam is that you might get paragraph questions where your answers are longer than just one-word answers, or you have to write an essay. So you're not just repeating the content, but you're applying your own knowledge and you're constructing a coherent argument there, and you use the evidence from the sources and your own knowledge as well. So those are very important skills in history. Okay, and then the next thing we're going to look at, before we look at the actual questions and the sources, we're going to look at the overview of paper 1. Because remember earlier on I told you that it is important to know the structure of the exam. So if you look at paper 1 is out of 150 marks and it's 3 hours long. And the instructions and information that you will get there is that the question paper consists of 6 questions. So you will get source-based questions. Let me quickly underline that so that you know. And you have to do this source-based questions. And then question 1 will be the Cold War. The main focus question is, how did the Cold War period shape international relations after the Second World War? So that is what we're doing today. We're looking at the origins of the Cold War. That is our question focus. Looking at the USSR and the United States creating the spheres of interest. And the question that you will need to answer is, who was to blame for the Cold War? And then the next question, question 2, is independent Africa. How was independence realized in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s? And the question focus for this theme is Africa in the Cold War, with Angola as the case study. Now it's very, very important to note that the case study in this paper is Angola. So don't go and study Zaire or other things that are not related to this particular paper, because then you will struggle to answer the exam questions. And then question 3 will be civil society protests in the 1950s, from the 1950s to the 1970s. So the main question there is, what forms of a civil society protest emerged from the 1960s to 1990? And the focus will be the United States civil rights movement. So that will be your section A. And then, and remember, you're supposed to make a choice. So you need to know if you're going to choose questions from the Cold War, independent Africa, or the civil society protests. And then you need to move on to section B, which is now the essay section of the paper. Okay, I'm quickly going to circle that so that you can see that they're testing different skills, as I said to you before, that it is very important to apply your skills when you are doing this exam. Question 4, the extension of the Cold War. So it's still on the Cold War, but it's no longer on the origins. It's now the extension of the Cold War. And the question focused there with the case study of Vietnam. So you need to know the Vietnam War very well if you are going to choose that essay. And then the next essay will come from the theme Independent Africa. How was independence realized in Africa in the 1960s and 1970s? That is where you are going to have a comparative study of the Congo and Tanzania. So you'll be looking at things like the successes and challenges faced by these countries after independence, both political and economic. Please make sure that you know both, because you don't know how the question is going to be phrased. You can't just look at the political and not look at the economic. And in some cases, you can be expected to look at the social as well. And then question 6 is civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s, and the question focus in this particular exemplar, the paper we're working with, is the Black Power movement. Okay, so the point I'm trying to make here is that if in the source analysis section, the question was on the one movement, let's just take the civil society protests as an example. If the question was on the civil rights movement, it means the essay question is going to be on the other movements. So it's very important to know the different movements within that theme. So I hope you now know the structure of paper 1. So what we'll do now, we are going to move on to the actual questions, and we will start by reading the source, and I'm going to show you how you need to analyze the source, because it's very, very important to understand the source before you can tackle the questions. Now let's look at the actual paper. So what you'll find in the exam is that there will be a caption. I'm going to underline or circle or highlight this. This is the caption that will give you information. So even before you read the source, make sure that you don't go straight to the source. Read the caption. Now the importance of reading the caption is that it tells you exactly what the source is about. It tells you when the source was made. If it's a speech, it tells you who was saying that speech, so that when you go on to reading the actual source, then you know exactly what you are reading. And this is the information that you will use later on if you get questions like, is this a reliable source? Is this a useful source? Before we read the caption and the actual source, you will find that all the sources will have this information at the bottom of each source. Okay, this one says from Public Papers, U.S. Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C., 1947, by Harry Truman. In most cases, when you're answering questions in the exam, you will not be using that information. In some cases, you might use it because sometimes that is the information that tells you whether the source is primary or not. Okay, but in most cases, if it's like a textbook, that is not the information you should be using, because that information is there to say the examiner has not plagiarized. That is where the examiner found that particular source. But then the same source can be found in 20 or 30 other different sources. So that is why I said to you earlier, the most important information is this caption here. So this one reads, this is an excerpt from a speech by U.S. President Harry Truman. So I'm going to quickly underline that so that you know exactly what the source is about. So you already know that the type of source this is that it is a speech. And who said it? It was the United States President Truman. And then it tells you that it was delivered on the 12th of March, 1947. Okay, you know the Truman Doctrine that was part of that speech. And then it carries on to tell you that the source focuses on the reasons. Okay, I'm going to quickly underline that as well. It's important. It focuses on the reasons why the Truman Doctrine was implemented. So even before you read the source, you already know what it is about. It's a speech by President Harry Truman, and it's on the reasons why the Truman Doctrine was implemented. So that when you go on to read the source, then you need to be able to take out those reasons. Now let's quickly read the source together. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is often a free one. Okay, I'm going to quickly underline the choice because that tells you that President Truman is obviously going to be comparing the two ways of life. One way of life is based on the will of the majority. So now you should be able to tell the difference between these two ways of life. We use a different color now, okay? And then this is the one way that he is looking at. So he says one way of life is based on the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. Now that is very, very important because that helps you understand the one way of life. So I'm just going to quickly write one here. That is the one way of life. And then he goes on to say the second way of life. So when you're comparing these two ways, you've already looked at the first one, okay, and you know what the first way of life consists of. And then he says the second way of life is based on the will of the minority. I'm going to use a different color for the second way of life so that you can see that. It starts from here. The second way of life is based on the will of the minority, forcibly imposed on the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedom. So already you know the difference between these two ways of life. So you can pick things that are comparable between these two ways of life. And remember, this is still part of the speech. And then he carries on to say, I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. That should be a clue as to what President Truman thought of the second way of life. He says attempted subjugation or suppression by armed minorities. He's saying that these people are armed. So already you can see that he's portraying the second way of life in a negative light. Even before you ask yourself, who are those people he is referring to? By armed minorities or outside forces, I believe that our help should be primarily through economic and financial aid. You might later on get a question asking you why it was important for the United States to get involved and help the different countries and how they help them. So already you can see here that he is saying that the United States needs to give economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability. That is the reason that he wanted to ensure economic stability and orderly political process. So in fact, after the Second World War, what he wanted to ensure was that there was peace and stability in Europe. And that was the reason or the basis of the Truman Doctrine. It is necessary only to glance at a map to realize that the survival and integrity of the Greek nation are of a grave importance in a much wider situation. If Greece should fall under the control of an armed minority, okay, I'm going to quickly highlight this part. Now he is saying that if the United States does not implement the Truman Doctrine, this is the danger that is going to happen, that Greece might fall under the control of an armed minority. the effect upon its neighbor, Turkey. So he's saying it's not only Greece that will fall, but that will affect the other countries as well. And now, from your own knowledge, you already know that we refer to that as the domino effect or theory, the domino theory. Okay, and said that would be immediate and serious. So he's saying it's going to be a problem if these countries are allowed to fall into communism, but he's not mentioning the word communism. Remember, he's just said the second way of life, but your own knowledge will tell you that he was referring to communism. Confusion and disorder might spread. That's another reason. Okay, earlier on we said he wanted to ensure economic and political stability, but now he is saying that there is going to be confusion and disorder, and he's saying those might spread through the entire Middle East. So those are the reasons behind the Truman Doctrine. So if you can underline and highlight all the important points, even before you read the questions, that will help you, and you will know what the source is about, so that when you go to answering the questions, the answers are already there. Now let's quickly look at our questions based on the source we've just read together. It says refer to source A. It's very, very important to read the instruction. You are not just using your own knowledge here, but you are using information in source A. And then question 1.1 says, name the 2 ways of life a nation must choose according to Truman. Now remember, earlier on when we were analyzing that source, I highlighted the different ways of life. And they've written the word 2 in capital letters, so you can't just give the one way, you have to give both, as mentioned in the president's speech. And then it says 2 times 1 equals 2. It's also important to look at the mark allocation, because it also guides you as to how much you can write. Name the 2 ways of life a nation must choose according to Truman. This is according to the source. It's not according to your own knowledge. So the 2 ways of life are that one way is based on the will of the majority, that is democracy, and then the other way is based on the will of the minority. That is straight from the source. And then the next question is, explain the following historical concepts in the context of the Cold War. Remember, I told you earlier on when we were looking at the checklist for this exam that it is important to know the historical concepts associated with the particular theme. Freedom of speech, you need to be able to explain that in your own words. So if you look at the possible response here, it's a state and democratic system, as in the United States, in which citizens were allowed to state their views or opinions. I'm not going to read the entire answer, but you should be able to say those things or explain them in your own words. And then another thing that you need to explain in your own words is political oppression. That is an easy one, and it's out of 2 marks. Then if you look at the possible answer again, it tells you that it is a system of government, as in the Soviet Union, which was based on the will of the minority. Again, I won't read the entire answer. If you would like to see the answers, they are on the DBE website. And then the next question is, what did Truman hope to achieve by giving economic and financial aid to free peoples? What did he hope to achieve? And again, this is according to the source. Economic stability, remember we underlined those things, that he said if the United States did not give that aid, then there was going to be confusion and chaos. So he wanted economic stability and orderly political system. He hoped to prevent the spread of communism, because that is how he portrayed the second way of life. And then the next question is how, according to Truman, again, it is telling you that this is according to Truman, would the fall of Greece affect Turkey? Remember that domino effect I spoke to you about earlier on. And then if you look at the possible response there, Turkey's fall would be immediate and serious. Turkey would also be taken over by the communists. The domino theory would apply. Okay? Confusion and disorder would spread in the Middle East. So in other words, problems will not just end in Greece, but they will carry on and affect other countries as well. And then the next question is, Comment on whether a historian doing research on the Cold War would consider the information in this source to be a reliable piece of historical evidence. I'm going to quickly underline reliable because these are the skills that I spoke to you about earlier on. Okay, is this a reliable source? And please note that this is different from is this a useful source? When we say is a source useful, that means can it be used to get information about a particular event. But then when you're asking if a source is reliable, then you're asking whether the source can be trusted in terms of, in this case, it says when you're researching the Cold War. So let's look at a possible response here. There are different possibilities here. That it is words of a speech presented by the president himself. It was at the time, that is when he said all those words, when capitalism and communism were competing and expanding their sphere of influence. The Truman Doctrine became the United States official government policy, and there was also a Greek Civil War during that time. So those are the reasons why this source can be trusted. Or if you choose to say it is not reliable, then you need to say, so in other words, it cannot be trusted, even though it is a primary source, it was said by the president himself, it is biased because it is the president's view. It doesn't give the whole picture of the Cold War. Only communism is seen as a threat according to this source. Okay, so before we move on to the next question, we're going to take a quick break and then we'll carry on and look at a different type of source. I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. Now we are looking at a different type of source. It's still a written source, but it's a different viewpoint. Now remember before the break, we looked at a speech by President Truman, the American president, and we highlighted the things that were portraying the communists in a negative light. So now we're looking at this one. Again, we read the caption. It's very, very important to read the caption. Andrei Vishninsky, a Russian foreign ministry official. Okay, I'm quickly going to underline that because that should give you a clue as to what the source is going to say. So source A, the first source, previous one, was by the president of the United States, but now this one is by a Russian. And he had the following opinion about the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. So this is the Russian response to what the president was saying earlier on. Now let's quickly read this together. The so-called Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan are particularly glaring examples of the manner in which the principles of the United Nations are violated. I'm going to underline violated, of the way in which the organization is ignored. So this Russian is accusing the United States of ignoring the United Nations and violating its principles. The United States government has moved towards direct renunciation, that means rejection of the principles of international collaboration. So you can already see that the Russians are blaming the United States of not wanting to work together, to collaborate with other people, and concerned action by the great powers and towards attempts to impose its will. That is another criticism, that the United States is trying to impose its will. Now remember that the main focus question is who was to blame for the Cold War. And the Russians claim that the United States is imposing its will on other independent states, that these countries are independent, but they're just imposing their will. While at the same time, obviously using the economic resources. Now remember that the Truman Doctrine led to the Marshall Plan, where the United States was giving money to the different European countries that were devastated after the war. So now the Russians are saying that the Americans are using the money to impose their will and to spread their interests. Then these are distributed as relief. And they're saying that the Americans are pretending that this is relief, whereas they are trying to impose their will. That is how you need to understand the source. To individual needy nations as an instrument of political pressure. That is very important. I'm going to underline that as well. So they're saying that this is not relief. It is just an instrument of political pressure because, as I said earlier on, they are accusing the United States of imposing its will. The United States also counted on making all these countries directly dependent. That's another thing that is very important, that the United States is not interested in just helping these countries because they were devastated by the war, but they want to make them dependent on the interest of American monopolies, the big companies, which are striving to avert or turn away the approaching depression by an accelerated export of commodities and capital to Europe. So they're saying, this source, if you read it carefully, it's saying that the United States did not have interest in helping these countries, but they were actually interested in the economic advancement of the United States. It is becoming more and more evident to everyone that the implementation of the Marshall Plan will mean placing European countries under the economic and political control of the United States. We've already looked at that they said the United States was imposing its will on these independent countries. So now they are repeating that in a different way by saying that the European countries receiving the aid are going to be under the economic and political control of the United States and direct interference by the latter in the international affairs of these countries. So in other words, they're claiming that these countries are going to lose their independence by accepting the Marshall Aid. Moreover, this plan is an attempt to split Europe into two camps. Now, this is very interesting because if you look at the source we looked at before the break, the President of the United States said the world is already divided into two. And now this source is saying that it is the United States that is dividing Europe into two camps. So they're saying that those camps were not there, but it's the United States, by initiating Marshall Aid, they are splitting Europe into two camps. And with the help of the United Kingdom and France, that means their allies, to complete the formation of a bloc of several European countries hostile. Okay, they're saying that these countries are hostile to the interests of the democratic countries of Eastern Europe, and most particularly the interests of the Soviet Union. So we looked at the first source by the president, and then this one is by the Russian. The first one was by the United States president, and this one is by the Russian. And already you can see how both these sources are biased. Now let's quickly look at the type of questions you can get from looking at these sources. Why did Wyszynski claim that America had violated the principles of the United Nations? So again, that will be found in the actual source. Okay, now let's look at the possible response here. The United Nations were not informed or consulted about the implementation of an international program. That means the recovery plans, the Marshall Plan. That was just the American policy, and they had not consulted the United Nations about it. The United Nations had not collaborated with the United States had not collaborated with other countries before announcing the Marshall Plan. Hence, they said they were just imposing their will. That is how they were violating the United States. I'm not going to read the entire answer, but I hope that gives you the idea of what is expected there. Explain why Wyszynski criticized the Marshall Plan. Give valid reasons for your answer. Now, we've already read the source and we know that he was criticizing the Marshall Plan, but now the question is why? Now, if you look at the possible answer there, it's because it was an American program. We know that because the Cold War was this war between the two ideologies, communism and capitalism. And also, it would ensure economic control by the United States. Remember, when we read the source, we did look at that, and we said the Russians viewed the Marshall Aid or the Marshall Plan as America's way of controlling the other countries, both economically and politically. So it goes on to say it would ensure political control by the United States, and the United States would interfere in internal affairs of other countries. Remember, I told you earlier on that they thought that these countries receiving Marshall Aid were going to lose their independence, and that Europe would be split into two camps. comment on why an American politician would disagree with the information in the source. I mean, obviously, it was a Cold War situation. They were not going to agree, but we need to give us the reason why they would disagree with it. And remember, I told you to look at the mark allocation. If you look at this, it tells you 2 times 2 equals 2. So you need to give at least 2 reasons here why an American politician, that means somebody who is working for the government, would disagree with the information in the source. And the reasons are obvious reasons. It gives a biased view of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan because it is by a Russian. The information in the source is too critical about the United States' role in Europe. And they do not state that the United States was merely trying to assist Europe with its economic problems. They are highly critical of the role of the United States because even though the United States might have had their own interests in helping Europe, the truth is that it was after the Second World War and a lot of the countries needed the help. So I hope that helps you understand the different types of sources. So we're going to take another quick commercial break, and when you come back, we are going to look at a different type of a source, and that will be a cartoon and how you can analyze that. I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. Now remember, before the break, we analyzed 2 written sources, but they were different viewpoints. One was by the United States President Truman, giving reasons for the Marshall Plan, and then the other one was a Russian response to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and we looked at the biases in both sources. We are now going to look at a different type of source, and this one is a cartoon. And there are specific skills that you as historians need to know when you're analyzing a cartoon. Now again, we're going to start with the caption because that is very, very important. Okay, the caption tells you that the cartoon was published in the Soviet Union. I'm going to quickly underline that. Okay, it was published in the Soviet Union magazine. Okay, I'm not going to highlight all the rest of the information. Okay, it's important to know where the cartoon comes from because when you're analyzing it, then you should be looking for clues that tell you that it was from the other side. Because obviously, even before we look at the cartoon, you know that it was from, if it was from the Soviet Union, it's going to portray the United States in a negative light. And then it also tells you that it was drawn by a team of the Russian artists. And then the title of the cartoon is Marshall Plan in Practice. So it's their views, it's the Russian views of the Marshall Plan. And then it also gives you a clue because remember, when you're analyzing a cartoon, it's very important to note that a cartoon is not like a photograph. Every little detail that is in the cartoon is there for a reason. The cartoonist has made a decision to include all those elements because they are helping in conveying a particular message that the cartoonist wants to convey. So in this case, the caption is giving you the clues to those elements that have been used in the cartoon. Now it tells you that General Marshall, so you already know that the person in the cartoon is General Marshall. I'm going to look at the cartoon now. Let's just finish the caption. Holds the life belts, so you already know that the life belts are there, and they're labeled for the French and for the Germans. So that is the help that was given to the European countries because the United States claimed that these countries needed the help after the war. And then behind that, it says for Italy, yet another country. The words in the cartoon have been translated from Russian into English. So now let's look at the different elements. I'm going to quickly circle the different things here. Remember, the caption told you that General Marshall. So you already know that this figure here is General Marshall, and you will know from your own knowledge that after the president gave his speech, which was later termed the Truman Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine was then translated into action through the Marshall Plan. So that is where the United States was then giving the aid to the countries. And then the caption also told us that there are life belts. Now, you know that a life belt is given to a person who is drowning. When you're swimming and you are drowning, you get a life belt to save you. So that is how the Americans would have portrayed the Marshall Plan, that they were helping people. Okay, so we can see the life belts. Okay, I'm just going to highlight one, but they are all over this cartoon. But what is very interesting and what makes this a Soviet cartoon is that they are not portraying these life belts as saving mechanisms, as things that were going to help the European countries. How do we know that? It's because attached to these life belts are, let me use a different color there, the guns. As you can see, there's a gun there, there's another one there, okay, there's another one there, and so on. So that shows you that the Russians viewed the Marshall Plan in a negative light. Said, yes, the Americans pretended that they were helping people, giving them the life belts, saving them, but there were hidden agendas behind the Marshall Aid. Now let's look at the type of questions you can get there. Explain the messages the cartoon conveys regarding the Marshall Plan. That should be very easy. When you've analyzed the cartoon, you know what the different things symbolize, then giving the message would be very easy. And the caption does tell you that it was drawn by a group or a team of Russian artists. So now let's look at the message. What exactly are they saying about the Marshall Plan? The USA is shown as a powerful and commanding force in Europe. It has been drawn as the captain of the ship. Okay, that was General Marshall that I circled in the cartoon earlier on. America is offering economic aid through the Marshall Plan, but in essence, it meant that the United States will ensure that they are obligated to their military imperialism. Remember those guns that I also circled, okay, that they said that the United States was claiming to giving life belts to the countries that were drowning after the war because of all the problems that they were experiencing, whereas in actual fact, according to the Russians, they were using their own military imperialism, in other words, spreading the American influence. That is how the Russians viewed their Marshall Aid. The cartoon shows military aid, the guns and the helmets being distributed, and not any economic aid. So you don't see that. You see the life belts, but you don't see the economic aid. Another thing that the cartoon does not show is the state Europe was in. You don't see Europe devastated after the war. They're just showing the Americans giving this aid. So the Russians are claiming that maybe that was even a lie, that Europe needed the aid that the United States offered to give them. The economic aid, as Marshall claimed, would be given, and the life belts can be interpreted as a means of control over the countries and not just economic help, as I've already said before. The United States is seen as saving Europe. Marshall is depicted as handing out these life belts, because remember I told you earlier on that a life belt is something you would give to someone who is drowning. So he's handing them out, which are usually thrown to save people who are drowning, as I've already told you. The life belts are given to European countries with strings attached. That is the military aid. Remember those guns that I showed you earlier on. So that is how the Russians viewed the Marshall Aid. And then the next question, 3.2, comment on whether the cartoonist gives a one-sided view about the Marshall Plan. That links with the previous question we've looked at, the one looking at the message of the cartoon. And you need to use the visual clues in the source to support your answer. Okay, now let's look at the possible response there. So the obvious answer is yes. Marshall's face looks evil. He doesn't look like a kind person, and he is not offering gifts of kindness. Out of kindness. He is giving away harnesses, not money. He's not giving them the money that they needed. It's just life belts. Life belts that were given by the United States had strings attached. Remember, we said that in the previous question. It came with military aid too. That was America's way. This is according to the Russians now. That was America's way of spreading their influence. The guns and swords and helmets are attached to the life belts, and they symbolize military control, that America wanted to control these countries, not just to give them economic aid. The cartoonist implies that the real aim was to extend the sphere of influence. That is what was behind America's reasons for giving the aid. And then the cartoon was published in Czechoslovakia as propaganda message not to use US aid. Or if you say no, then it depicts the Marshall Plan the way it was, and was a form of economic and political support to other countries. Other countries needed the support from the USA. If you do choose that particular answer, the problem will be that you will not be using all the visual elements in the cartoon, because you'll only be looking at the life belts and you will not be looking at the guns attached to those life belts. It's very important. Remember, I told you earlier on that everything that is in the cartoon is there for a reason, and it aids in spreading that particular message. So I hope all those sources, from the written sources to the cartoon, have helped you understand how you will be expected to analyze questions in the exam. And I hope you will all do very, very well. Good luck, and thank you.